Hello everyone, welcome back. Today is all about dried gouache. I'm going to tell you everything I learned over the last month and a half painting with this almost every single day. Before this, I was using gouache out of the tube or in a wet palette where you squeeze the paint in and then you seal it airtight in between uses. So it was always like fresh liquid gouache. But dried gouache means that you're squeezing the paint into half pans like this or some kind of container and letting it dry in between uses, which makes it feel a little bit more like you're using watercolor. However, gouache is definitely more opaque, at least the high quality brands are. I put a variety of brands in here to kind of test and compare them, and I do have some thoughts about the brands, but I want to say that after a month and a half of using a bunch of different brands over and over and over again, letting them dry, re-wetting them, letting them dry, re-wetting them, it does kind of change the consistency of the gouache. So what you start off with in the first week or two is not what you're going to end up with in a couple months. For instance, some of the colors that started off as my favorites because they were very creamy and flowy even after they dried and I re-wet them. After a month and a half or so, those ones are kind of starting to crumble a little bit and get not necessarily grainy, but they don't have the same consistency. And I think that's partially due to the fact that the more you re-wet them and let them dry in between uses, it's solidifying and becoming liquid again. And that water content isn't quite soaking all the way in. And certain colors, no matter what brand it is, are going to be harder than others, like cobalt, burnt umber. Those ones crumble and get dry really, really, really fast. Blacks seem to as well. In the description, you'll find a blog post with all of the brands and colors and notes about the differences, and just things that I found over the course of the last month and a half of using these, just like notes that might be helpful. But in this video, I'm going to show you what this gouache looks like and how it performs after a month and a half. Let's start off talking about the palette. And of course you can use any palette, any watercolor palette would work, or any kind of container that you might keep paint in. But I chose the portable painter because I was painting outside the whole time and I needed something very portable. The portable painter is probably my all-time favorite outdoor palette because it comes with its own water dishes that are also how it stands up, and you can use it in various ways, but it also has enough mixing space for me. And of course everyone's going to be different with that. You can bring extra mixing trays if you need them. I actually have 3 of these and I took off one of the larger mixing wells and added it to this one. It just was like a little modification that I could do to give myself even more big mixing trays. Anyway, I also have a couple of the custom trays in here, the long ones that fill in the space that was originally used for the brush. When I first put the paint into this, I had to let it sit for maybe about 5 days before it started to really get harder. A couple of the colors got harder faster, like the cobalt blue and the burnt umber, but a bunch of them are still actually wet, like the cobalt turquoise light and the titanium gold ochre. So there are certain colors out there that just are extra liquidy and they don't dry as easily. I mean, eventually if I let this sit in like the sun or something for ages or on a hot windowsill, it would probably fully dry. But it's interesting because although they are still liquidy and malleable, they don't spill out of the palette. So it's kind of the best of both worlds there. And speaking of which, having a palette like this, you know, I can close it up and put it back together, but it's not really leak proof. If you pour your paint in and you have to go out immediately, it's going to spill. That happened to me because I was in a rush and so I tried to hurry the process. But yeah, it's just something to keep in mind that to set up your palette in the first place, you have to give it enough time to cure a little bit in the palette before tossing it in your bag or letting it tip upside down. I had a theory that if I poured the gouache into this and just let it sit open like this, the paint would start to crack really fast. And although that wouldn't be like the worst thing because they probably will get that way eventually, I wanted it to slow dry. So what I did was poured it all in and I shut the lid like that. I think I actually shut both lids and let it sit for pretty much a week before using it. And that way it was very slow drying. And then in comparison, I made a couple smaller half pans of just a couple brands, poured it in and let it sit on my shelf in open air. And those turned really hard, really fast, and were super cracked. So slow drying it seemed to help a little bit. I didn't add any mediums into these for the first week or two. I just wanted to see how it would naturally dry. But I did experiment a little bit with the whites, adding some of the watercolor blending medium by Winsor Newton, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, it's just straight out of the tube into here, let it slow dry, and it worked out really well. One thing I noticed is that it is nearly impossible to keep a palette like this clean. Not that the colors spill into each other, but you know, they just kind of get all up on the sides, and because I'm using it outside constantly, coming and going, I don't have the patience to always clean it thoroughly. So over the course of a couple months, it gets just so messy. And I made the mistake of putting some fresh white into this and then forgetting that. And I put it in my bag and there's white paint still everywhere. So, you know, you do have to be a little bit mindful of how, when you put the paint in and when you're using it and all of that. Let's go to the studio and I'll show you some close-ups and give you some more insights about the process of using it. And we're also going to do an opacity test just to show you the differences between using it fresh out of the tube and out of the palette. As a reminder, I posted a video showing my whole process for creating this custom palette of dried gouache with lots of insights. And I also posted a long recap video of my experience painting outside every day during April, during which I used the dried gouache the majority of the time. Links are in the description for those videos. So while I talk about the dried gouache during this video, keep in mind that I successfully used it outside every day for over a month on toned paper, using all my favorite techniques, including layering. So although you may see my messy, chunky, dried palette, it doesn't mean it's not usable. And I think it can be easy to forget how wonderful it is to use when I'm dissecting it in a video like this. Let's take a look at what the palette looks like after it sits for 2 weeks without using it. You might be surprised that some of the colors look like they have some moisture in there, but some of the colors are very dry. I'll poke some of them so you can kind of see how they really are under that top moisture. So this one is pretty chunky. Still pretty malleable though. I could probably mix that down to a nice creamy consistency. This is a custom color, so we'll skip over that one. This is the Winsor Newton Cobalt Turquoise Light, and as you can see, it's pretty creamy still. There's definitely some bigger chunks along the edges, but I could easily mix that down into a very creamy consistency. Transparent colors like the phthalo turquoise and such are going to be a little bit chunkier and harder when they dry, but this one actually stayed relatively moist. I mean, when I pick up big pieces of it, it looks chunky, but it's very, very soft still. So I think that's partially due to the fact that Schmincke uses ox gall in their paint. So, you know, if the paint you use doesn't have that additive, it may behave very, very differently. I barely have any ultramarine left, but I'll show you what I do have, and it gets pretty dry and crumbly, but as soon as I water it down, it gets really nice again. So it was a great color to have in this palette. As I mentioned, the cobalt is going to be very dry, so this is not uncommon, and you'll find that among all the brands. But although it was very dry, I was able to reactivate it pretty easily and get a nice consistent brush stroke with it, which I'll show you soon. The quinacridone magenta is also one of those that stays pretty chunky but very soft. So with a little bit of water, I can get it nice and smooth again, and it behaved really well throughout the month. And of course, burnt umber is another one of those that dries really fast and it just gets super, super crumbly. And if that's a problem for you, I mean, I was able to spray it and use it just fine, and I used it a lot actually. You can see there's barely any left, but it did get a little annoying that it dried so fast. Even during the painting session, I had to constantly spray it. And this is a custom color that I made with my burnt umber and white and maybe a little yellow in there. And here is the Titanium Gold Ochre by Schminke. It's extremely creamy still. I didn't have any issues with this one. It was a really awesome color to have in the palette. These last two are custom colors, which I'll skip over because really when you make a custom color, it's going to be custom to you. So there's no point in me comparing it to anyone else's. And these are two of the colors that I originally had in the palette but decided to take out and then just let them dry on the shelf naturally to see what would happen. So you can see they have a lot more of those big fissures, the big cracks, and I'll show you how they behave when we paint with them. Yeah, this is how they look after a month and a half. I've sprayed my gouache and let it sit for about 5 minutes, and as you can see, most of them look like they're ready to go. So sometimes I'll stir them with a palette knife, but usually I'm just diving right in with my brush. And as you can see, some of them like this one, I could potentially pick up chunks of color on my brush if I do that. And when I'm outside painting and I'm kind of going fast, I don't really care. But if you're in the studio or doing something where you need like a really nice consistent brush stroke, you may want to take extra time and kind of mix and break up some of those big chunks. But for the sake of this video and using it the way I've been using it, I'm just going to show you what it looks like doing it this way. So picking up as much color as I can on the brush without tons of chunks. Of course, you can see that mine is a little bit tinted with blue, so it kind of looks a little bit more green. So just ignore that side of it, and we're really only focusing on the opacity for this. Like I said, with this one, it stayed really creamy, so there's not much effort in picking up a nice amount of creamy gouache there. This color, the Pyrrole Red, was one of them that was sitting on my shelf, so I sprayed this one as well just a couple minutes ago. I found that if you spray the color maybe 5 to 10 minutes before painting, it helps a lot because the water has time to soak in and penetrate all of those pigment particles. You might even want to spray it twice. Just give yourself enough time before you start painting to let it soak in. Some of the colors will reactivate way easier than others, and you really will only know which ones do that after using them for a while. So this is the Daniel Smith, and I actually found that Daniel Smith is amazing for dried gouache. The whole line reactivates pretty easily as well. It gets really dry in between, but I found that it's pretty much easy to use once you get it nice and re-wetted and let it sit for a while. Usually I really like dig at my burnt umber to get it to flow, and I try to avoid picking up all those chunks. But it's such a strong color that I can usually get really opaque color with it without that much of a struggle. Like I said, with this one, it's basically straight out of the tube still. It's super creamy. This one re-wets really easily as well. I think most of the Schminkas do. Once the cobalt sits with some water, it gets relatively soft. So I didn't really have issues with this one, even though it does dry like rock hard between uses. Okay, here we have it. This is fully dried. The top line is the color out of the tube, and the line underneath is the one from the dried paint. You can definitely see some of them are more transparent from the dried palette, but not many. And red, yellows, magentas, those are mixing colors. So I'm never really using those straight out of the tube or straight out of the pan. I'm always mixing that with something else. So it doesn't have to be super, super opaque. It's actually better if it's a little bit transparent because it mixes really, really well. But colors like blue and the earthy tones, I want them to be more opaque because I will often use those a little bit more raw from the pan and maybe mix a little white in or kind of mix them here and there, but I need those colors to be pretty strong. because occasionally I do use them as pure color. These, of course, I'm going to mix into lots of greens, and the opacity of these combines with the power of and transparency of these, and it makes a really good mix. So if opacity is extremely important to you, you may want to do some tests with specific colors from specific brands, but just a mixture of brands here and a ton of different colors, you can see that it really doesn't make a huge difference in most of the colors. So yes, you can get opaque color with these, but where it does make a difference is how far you can get this wet color to go. So you spray it, you let it sit for a while, and some of it soaks up and you can get some color to move around, but you can't make these colors go as far as colors straight from the tube. With this, you can spread this around an entire sheet of paper and get really opaque color, but you can only get so much out of here. So if you're doing bigger paintings, this might not be the best route for you. I usually stick with something that's like 8 by 10 or smaller, and it's perfectly fine for that. I just got this overwhelming desire to paint a bird. I think I want to paint a blackbird because I see a lot of them lately. Maybe a robin. So I'm out with my camera trying to capture some footage since they don't stick around for long once I get close. Okay, I'm back outside. I'm gonna do a little painting and show you guys kind of how I use the palette. Even though you did see a lot of that during Plein Air Pro, I'll give you some more insights about the actual painting process with a dried palette. I mentioned earlier that I put blending medium in the white, and that was to allow me to use it in a more fluid way during the painting process. This is rather sticky because it's fresh from the tube, and then I let it dry. So this is good when I want to do like a dry brush texture, but this is very liquidy still, and it takes a really long time, like weeks, for this to dry enough so that it won't spill all over my palette. So if you're going to add blending medium to your colors, do it very sparingly just at the very beginning, and then let it sit or slow dry for maybe a couple weeks before you use it outside, because it will tilt when this tips in your backpack, which is inevitable. The liquid paint is going to spill, so you might get all the colors running into each other or spilling out of the palette. So I sprayed this about 15 minutes ago, and already the burnt umber is getting dry, the cobalt's getting dry. So as you can see, if you're outside, you'd probably have to spray it more often. So I just give it a really good drenching with the spray bottle, then let it sit for a couple minutes. I'm gonna paint a blackbird because I think it's a good way of showing what the dried gouache can do and how similar it is to gouache out of the tube, because I'm going to be using really dark color and then lighter color on top of that. I've got my black gouache back in the palette in its own little corner. If you'd like a full tutorial on how I use dried gouache to paint this bird, check out my Patreon tutorial link in the description. I find that painting with the gouache and the dried palette, like in this setup, is really great for dry brush textures because it doesn't take long before the gouache starts to dry a little bit in the palette, and that makes it a lot easier to lay down your juicy layers, but then quickly transition into very, very dry brush textures, which obviously are my favorite. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that I just love using dry brush textures. Just want little hints of blue, nothing crazy, so I'm kind of going back and forth between the blue and the black. Typically, I start with my more diluted layer and then I build up the opacity. And you can definitely do that with this, but I usually use less layers, mostly because I'm painting outside and I'm working rather quickly, so I don't want to wait for more than 2 or 3 layers to dry. But for the first layer, all I need to do is make sure I have enough water in my black color, and I'm going to paint relatively thickly, and at first it comes out rather diluted because I have a lot of water in there, but the more I pick up the color on my brush and soak up all that water, the less water will be in there and I'll end up picking up more color. And I guess that does depend on the color you're going with. Like if I was using my cobalt turquoise light, that's very runny and it's never really going to dry in the pan. So I can just pick it up as much as I want and I get fresh color. Whereas the black dries out pretty fast and I have to eventually add more water if I want to pick up more color. So right now I'm getting close to like using up all the water in there, and I'm going to end up with very, very dry brush strokes. So I can get my brush wet, swirl it around in the black, and then I can make that color go a lot farther. But in doing so, it's a little bit diluted. So once again, I'm just I'm swirling my brush in there to pick up as much paint as I can. And I may have to come back with another layer on top of any areas that I want to be very, very dark. There we go. All right. So if you guys have any other questions for me about dried gouache, let me know. I could do a part 3 in the future, maybe a couple months from now. But I am just in love with using gouache this way. It suits my style of painting so well. And because I paint outside the majority of the time, it suits my lifestyle. And I just find it so much more relaxing than painting with my wet gouache palette because there's so much less maintenance and I don't have to worry about it drying out because it's already dry. The only thing I have to do is, make sure I monitor how much water I'm using depending on how I'm using it in the moment. Overall, I find it just to be a really fun, relaxing way of painting, and I'm definitely going to keep doing it for the foreseeable future. I'm sure I'll be doing wet gouache again at some point, probably in the studio more often, but at the moment I'm just painting outside because it's beautiful. So in any of my future videos or tutorials about gouache, you can be using it dried in a pan or out of the tube. It really won't matter because it just comes down to how you apply it to the paper. But I'm having so much fun with it and I cannot wait to just take advantage of this kind of setup this summer when I'm painting on the coast. Oh my gosh, I just heard thunder, so I'm gonna pack up and go inside before everything gets destroyed. And I will see you all very soon. Take care. Okay, it's time to talk about dried gouache. It's finally time to talk about dried gouache. I'm finally ready to talk about dried gouache. Hello everyone, my name is Sarah and I am 2 seconds in, I'm already getting paint all over myself.